The Russian Federation itself opened Pandora's box by deciding that international borders can be unilaterally changed by force. But that's a double-edged weapon that fires in both directions. So what happens if you play by these exact rules, but in a completely literal sense? Let's take a detailed look at what Russia's own map would actually look like if we applied its very own logic back to itself. Without access to the oceans and global trade routes, without the main oil and gas reserves that currently feed the budget, without strategic control over the Arctic, and without a gateway to Europe. If you apply this logic honestly, then instead of the world's largest country, all that's left on the map is a shadow of former greatness. A completely different state with a completely different fate, small, poor, and spiteful. After all, the Kremlin, in demanding historical justice, has forgotten the main fact. A fact that people in Russia are even afraid to think about, because it shatters their entire worldview. Russia is not a monolith, it is a patchwork empire stitched together over centuries from foreign lands by bayonets and coercion. And if you remove everything that was annexed, everything colonial, and everything held by force, what remains is a completely different Russia. And this stark difference might frighten Russians significantly more than any external threats. Let's start with the East. The Far East, primary Vladivostok, the Amur region, and Transbaikalia are not originally Russian lands. These vast territories were annexed in the 19th century, at the expense of China and other sovereign states through aggressive military expansion and treaties signed under pressure. By the same logic that Russia now uses to demand border revisions from its neighbors, it arguably should not possess these territories. The Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin are the result of the outcome of World War II, not of any eternal historical belonging. Karelia, part of the Kola Peninsula, and the previously held Finnish territories are lands taken from Finland as a direct result of the Winter War. If borders can be revised, then they can be renegotiated in both directions. But here it is important to understand one fundamental thing. It's not about specific regions or lists of territories. The fundamental point is that Russia, without these lands, ceases to function effectively as a state, because historically it was built and developed not around a stable core, but around constant expansion. Modern Russia does not exist without various colonies, economically, politically, or psychologically. But so that this doesn't sound like just a theory, let's look at how this specific logic worked in practice. Not in the abstract, but at specific moments in history, when Russia had already raised the question of its borders, and each time received the same result. The first case is 1917. The Russian Empire collapses, the center weakens, and almost immediately the peripheries begin to disappear. Finland, Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, the Caucasus. None of them broke away by accident. They all seized the opportunity when the Imperial center lost its capacity to maintain effective control. As soon as central authority disappeared, the borders dissolved as well. The second historical case occurred in 1991. The Soviet Union was not defeated in a war, it was not occupied, it collapsed from within because the center could no longer hold the system together. And again we see this very same recurring pattern. First, the republics declare independence and leave, then the economic space collapses. And finally, the center is left with a vast territory that can no longer exist as it did before. The third case is the most illustrative, and it begins after 2014. The annexation of Crimea was presented as the return of historical lands. But it was precisely from this moment that Russia once again set in motion a process that had already twice led to its collapse. The revision of borders from the outside automatically triggered a revision of borders from within, even if so far only at the level of questions rather than concrete decisions. But that's only for now. Notice, in both cases, Russia lost territories not because someone turned out to be stronger. It lost them because it was the first to destroy the principle of the inviolability of borders on which its own empire was built. The third case, as we can see, is approaching. Every time the center began to justify the revision of borders under any pretext, it deprived itself of the moral and political right to maintain those same borders within the country. And at that moment, the collapse was no longer a matter of external pressure, but a consequence of the center's own decisions. This is the crucial historical fact that many people in Russia today prefer not to remember. For Russia, the revision of borders has never been a tool for strengthening itself. Never! Historically, it has consistently reached the point of no return. And following every one of those occurrences, the country never returned to its previous state. An empire is not just a sprawling and immense territory, it is a fundamental way for a state to exist. It is a system in which the center lives at the expense of the periphery, not the other way around. In such a system, the regions do not develop, they serve the metropolis. That is precisely why Russia reacts so painfully to any talk of self-determination. Not because the country would fall apart, but because the very logic that has sustained it for centuries would disappear. When this concept breaks down, one deeply unsettling reality becomes clear. Within Russia, there is no shared common political agreement, no single unified historical project, and no voluntary consent of the various peoples to live together in this current form. There is now nothing remaining but the inertia of the empire and the deep-seated fear of its disappearance. That is precisely why any discussion about Russia's natural borders ends in disaster. Because every such conversation inevitably comes down to the question, where exactly does the influence of Moscow finally end and everything else begin? And Russian statehood has no secure or definitive answer to this question. The North Caucasus is a vivid example. Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, and other republics of the region never joined Muscovy voluntarily. It was a protracted military conquest, long Caucasian wars, the suppression of local resistance, mass deportations, and punitive operations. By the same logic that Russia now applies to other countries, the North Caucasus is clearly not its natural sovereign territory. The Volga region is yet another layer of imperial legacy. Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Chuvashia, Mariel, Mordovia, Finno-Ugric, and Turkic peoples whose cultures have been facing Russification for centuries. These territories are not part of the Russian world, but are colonial regions, kept within the state by strict administrative control and forceful means. Their inclusion in Russia was never the result of a free and equal choice. Kuban, Belgorod, Kursk, and Voronezh, territories with a deeply rooted Ukrainian historical and cultural presence, which were ultimately incorporated into Russia as a result of the systematic process of imperial expansion. Kazakh lands within modern-day Russia, Orenburg, Chelyabinsk, Omsk, Tomsk, parts of Saratov and Irkutsk regions were never originally Russian. This is the result of the empire's advance deep into the steppes, not the natural formation of a state. Buryatia, Yakutia, the lands of the Khanty, Mansi, Evenks, and other peoples of Siberia, these are not Russia in the historical sense. These are territories that existed for centuries outside the Moscow world and were incorporated into it by force. Until the moment they were seized, they had no connection whatsoever to Muscovy. Without them, Russia ceases to be not only an empire, but even the state as we know it. And here it is important to understand, an empire can exist for decades out of inertia, even when its internal foundations have long since been destroyed. It is held together not by consent, but by fear, not by the future, but by the past. But as soon as this inertia collides with a real revision of borders, the illusion of stability disappears very quickly. If you consistently apply the same principle that Russia uses to justify its seizures, you end up with a completely different map, without imperial ambitions, without colonial possessions, without illusions about the great Russian world. What remains is a state that has never been great without violence, expansion, and the subjugation of other peoples. That is precisely why talk of revising borders is mortally dangerous for Russia itself. Not merely for its immediate neighbors, and not just for Ukraine, but for Russia itself, because this conversation dismantles and destroys not other countries, but the very structure of the Russian Empire. It fundamentally calls into serious question not just individual regions, but the very foundation of its existence. So let's talk about this more deeply. After all, this is perhaps the main paradox. For many long years, Russia tried to convince the world that it was strong because it was great. But it turned out that it was great only because it never asked itself the most critical question. Why are all these vast lands regarded as its own in the first place? As soon as that specific question was asked, the map began to fall apart. The Pandora's box that Russia has opened can no longer be closed. Now, the revision of Russia's borders is not a question of if it will happen, but a question of exactly when. And this entire process was not started in Washington or Brussels. It was started directly in the Kremlin,